The G20 concluded on Saturday, and there were new developments in ongoing international affairs involving the U.S. Plus, the summit had its own impact on host Argentina. Stay tuned for more.
And new details for the Mueller probe. Paul Manafort violated his plea deal and Michael Cohen pleaded guilty. Keep an eye out for our full breakdown.
And a little-known Supreme Court case is challenging an old judicial precedent. We'll have more on those odds later. This is Talking Points. The leaders of the top 20 economic powers met this weekend in Buenos Aires, marking the first time a South American nation has hosted the G20 Summit. Good evening, I'm Elijah Shama.
And I'm Gilat. Melamed. President Trump and other leaders entered the Argentinian capital with plenty of baggage and lofty goals. Talking Points analyst Conor Wight is here with how the meeting turned out. Conor?
That's right, guys. There were many stories that came out of this year's G20 Summit, but for the United States and many other member states, the biggest was trade and trade relations. President Trump celebrated a victory by signing the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement with the leaders of our neighbors to the north and south, which is designed to replace the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke positively about the New Deal and what it means for their countries and their legacies. Now, in spite of the historic signing, it is up to the legislatures of each country to ratify the agreement, and the president is confident that Congress will vote in favor of the USMCA. The United States and China also reached an agreement of sorts following a tumultuous trade war over steel and aluminum imports. New Year's Day originally meant new escalation in that trade war as the United States was set to increase tariffs from 10 to 25% on Chinese imports. Now, however, that plan is suspended and China is planning on increasing U.S. purchases following what the White House describes as a very successful meeting between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. This was the backdrop for all the leaders present at the summit as they agreed to reform the World Trade Organization at the next summit in Osaka. The United States, European Union, China, and more have lambasted the organization for being ineffective and at times unfair to one trade partner or another. Moving away from trade to the more controversial leaders in attendance, President Putin of Russia and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia seen here clapping hands like teammates on a sports team in what many describe as an eerie image. According to anonymous sources, the CIA believes that the Crown Prince ordered the killing of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi in October. Despite international condemnation and calls for an international investigation, President Trump says that it may never be known if Salman ordered the killing and has been forced to defend the relationship with the country. And earlier this week, Russia seized Ukrainian ships and sailors, thrusting the country into martial law. This led President Trump to cancel an anticipated formal meeting with Putin, though the White House says they did speak briefly during the summit. We can look ahead to June for the next summit meeting where firm answers on dealing with climate change and the WTO may be answered. Guys?
Thanks, Conor. We're joined now by Syracuse University student and Buenos Aires native Camila Grijera known to talk about protests in Argentina's capital before international leaders flew in. So, Camila, what did it mean for Argentina to be the first South American country to host this? Obviously, Mauricio Macri was very happy about this fact. Can you just talk a little bit about what it means?
So it's a really big deal that Argentina hosts this country, this summit, because we've been off the map for the past 12 years under the presidency of Néstor and then Cristina Kirchner. So now we're able to fortify and strengthen international relations with the leaders of the world-leading countries.
And Elijah, you mentioned those protests that unfolded in Buenos Aires. Camila, can you talk a little bit more about how those protests unfolded?
So to prepare for the protests, the government declared a national holiday and all forms of public transportation were paralyzed. Most of the protests took place in front of the Argentine Congress. However, they were pretty mild and they were mostly protesting anti-capitalism as well as the fact that the IMF is giving Argentina loans.
So the G20 is a meeting of the 20 biggest economies in the world. Argentina's present in that list. So can you talk a little bit about Argentina's economy, because it hasn't always been in that top 20?
So Argentina's economy is really fragile at the moment just because we had really bad leadership in the past. So right now, Argentina is focusing on making better trade deals with other leading countries as well. And as I said before, placing itself back on the map because we have a lot to offer, and through good leadership and effective reforms, we can get there.
And speaking of leadership, President Macri is up for re-election in 2019. Can you talk about how what he did in the summit might play into that re-election bid?
So Mauricio Macri, I think he did a really good job in hosting the summit. He made really good trade deals with really important countries such as the United States and also bilateral agreements with China. He actually signed 32 commercial agreements with China. So this is definitely placing him in good light. So I think that places him in a good position for his re-election in 2019.
All right, Camilla, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The U.S. has been a democracy since its inception, but for other countries, this hasn't always been the case. As Sabrina Maggiore explains, the Spanish government's recent plans to exhume a former dictator from a controversial monument is quite literally digging up unresolved issues from the nation's authoritarian past.
Located just outside of Madrid, the Valley of the Fallen has always been a controversial monument for Spaniards. That's because behind these doors lie the remains of one of the most controversial figures in Spanish history. Francisco Franco ruled Spain for 70 years, a reign that was marked by lack of civil liberties and a crackdown on political opponents.
You didn't have freedom for expression, for speech.
Luis Suárez Carreño was part of a rebel organization during Franco's dictatorship. He spent nearly 3 years in prison for speaking out against Franco's regime.
You were interrogated and you were tortured, or you were subject to different kind of pressure.
Following Franco's death in 1975, Spain transitioned to democracy. The government passed an amnesty law, and the official policy was to forgive and forget. But Suárez Carreño says because of this, there wasn't accountability for the crimes committed.
Not only they were never taken into trial, but were never even known by most of the Spanish society.
In many ways, the Spanish government's new plan to move Franco's remains from the Valley of the Fallen is reopening some old wounds. While the valley is officially a monument to honor victims on both sides of the Civil War, the site is seen by many as one that honors Franco. The current socialist government sees removing Franco's remains as necessary to democracy, but the move is unpopular with many in Spain. Right here outside of El Valle has been one of the most prominent meeting points for protesters who say Franco's body should stay right where it is. Juan Chicharo agrees with the protesters. He says the move is a misguided attempt to erase history and a distraction.
It's really a matter of politics to perhaps to divert people talking about things instead of talking about the real problem we have in Spain today.
The battle right now is over the future of Franco's remains, and the clash pits Franco's family against the government.
Now the family is free for putting the rest of the dictator in any Catholic church because it's their right, and they have chosen the Cathedral of Madrid.
Spain's government has since said it won't permit this, but the decision ultimately lies with the church. So far, the Archbishop of Madrid said he wouldn't prevent Franco's exhumation from the Basilica in the Valley of the Fallen, and he also said he wouldn't stop Franco's heirs from burning the dictator in the crypt of Madrid's cathedral. The situation has grown increasingly complex, but government officials promised to exhume Franco by the end of this year, and they're running out of time to find another solution. For Talking Points, I'm Sabrina Maggiore.
Plea deals are back in style in D.C. We'll have more on the Mueller probe and its targets after the break.
There's one thing you can never have sex without.
It's not something you buy.
Or something you take.
In fact, there's only one way to get it.
It has to be given to you, freely.
It's consent.
Because sex without it isn't sex.
It's rape. Consent.
If you don't get it, you don't get it. It's on us to stop sexual assault.
Learn how and take the pledge at itsonus.org.
Visit aarp.org/caregiving for information on how to provide even better care for the person who once took care of you.
Did you hear about the pony with a sore throat? He was a little horse. Can I tell you a cat joke? Just kidding. Why couldn't the Why was the basketball court all wet? Why? Because the players kept dribbling all over it. Where do cats go on vacation? New York.
Last week saw a couple of major developments in Robert Mueller's Russia probe. First, President Trump's former campaign manager Paul Manafort violated his plea deal. Then Trump's personal lawyer Michael Cohen flipped and pleaded guilty. Here to discuss how it all went down and what this could mean for President Trump is Talking Points analyst Brandon Ross. So let's walk through this. Let's start with Manafort. What happened there?
So Manafort is facing a litany of charges at both the D.C. local level and at the federal level. Some cases he has already been found guilty. Others he made a plea deal with Robert Mueller in order to bring those charges down. However, recently it was found out that he had violated the terms of his plea deal by lying to both the FBI, who was investigating, and of course to special counsel Robert Mueller. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops, but it's certainly not looking good for Manafort, as this is something that most people didn't really expect him to do.
So by, violating this plea deal, what does this mean on the Mueller investigation and investigations going forward?
Well, I think in specific regards to Paul Manafort, I think what both sides have agreed to is that both the prosecutors and Manafort's legal team don't really know where to go from here. Both of them are sort of at an impasse of how to go forward. And I think both sides are likely just going to go to have a sentencing date set for all the charges he's already been convicted of but not been sentenced for, and all those crimes he has pled guilty to, but he has violated the terms of the agreement. And so we'll see what happens there. And we don't have a date for that yet, but it will probably be sometime soon.
So let's switch gears a little bit. Michael Cohen also switched his plea deal to a guilty plea. So what does that mean for him?
Well, it's getting really interesting because for a long time he was probably the only big holdout left. A lot of people speculated that he was probably expecting some kind of a pardon from President Trump, something that he has thrown around in the past for many of his close allies, Paul Manafort included. So it wasn't too speculative for him to think that, but he saw it probably wasn't coming, and so he has pleaded guilty. And something that came out of that was some big revelations. The fact that Trump actually was involved, at least according to Michael Cohen, in some Russian business dealings. He was looking to build some sort of grand skyscraper in Moscow, and this was happening right over the course of the election cycle.
So we spoke about Trump's former campaign manager, we spoke about Trump's attorney, but what does this mean for the president himself?
It's not a good look, for sure, to have two of your closest allies flip on you. And while Manafort hasn't himself actually done anything to implicate the president, he's actually not. More than anything, President Trump hasn't. Well, Manafort hasn't done anything to actually implicate the president. Just the fact that he lies shows something. And by Michael Cohen flipping his testimony to Congress, it doesn't reflect well on the president.
So quickly, if there's going to be someone else to fall, who's it going to be? Are we talking about Rick Gates? Or are we talking about someone that we don't even know of yet?
Well, it would probably be Rick Gates, seeing as he was the domino to fall alongside Paul Manafort. They're very allied closely, and Brad Pascal is set to manage Trump's campaign in 2020. He was involved on the social media side in 2016, but I really doubt that he's going to be one to flip, mostly because not sure what there is for him to offer. Rick Gates is probably the next one to fall if any others fall.
All right, Brandon, we know you'll be watching this closely for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last Wednesday, the Senate rebuked President Trump's measure to continue U.S. military support for a Saudi-backed conflict in Yemen. The vote follows an investigation by the CIA into the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Talking Points analyst Michael Furnari is here with the details. Michael, thanks for joining us. And first, can you just start off by telling us a little bit more about the conflict in Yemen and also what this vote entailed?
Yeah, Gilat, Yemen is really a mess right now. Things are not very good in that country. So there's been a civil war going on in Yemen since 2015 between the leaders of the government and rebels. And over 100,000 people have died and over 3 million people have been displaced as a result of this civil war. And over the last few years, what's really happened almost echoes what's happened in Syria in a way, in that so the government has been backed by Saudi Arabia, by the UAE, in terms of weapon sales and all kinds of money and different things like that. And then the rebels are being backed by Iran. So of course, this issue in Yemen has kind of turned into another Middle East security dilemma for the United States, where they're trying to balance their interests with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, with Russia, with Iran, in this kind of regional chess game they're playing right now in the Middle East. And so that's what's going on in Yemen, and that's how it pertains to Congress. But what has actually happened in the Senate is that the Senate has really kind of challenged President Trump and his administration's stance on this issue. Now, the administration has been pretty supportive of Saudi Arabia. They've sold a lot of weapons to Saudi Arabia in the past, and they've been very friendly to them. And they've really kind of swept the killing of Jamal Khashoggi under the rug in a lot of senses. And what's happening here is that the Senate moved forward a resolution that they would challenge the United States' involvement in Saudi Arabia in terms of weapon sales and troop presence.
So how does Jamal Khashoggi's death directly link to this? I mean, we're talking about a regional chess game, like you just said. How does the death of Washington Post opinions columnist fit into that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's part of a larger picture where I think the Senate feels powerless in a lot of ways on this issue, where, of course, they don't have the power to decide which troops go and stay, what money goes and stays necessarily. And they feel like they're being lied to, I think, by the president and by the administration. Now, this, of course, the timing is what's really kind of makes the connection here, in that this is, Saudi Arabia has been kind of dishonest for a while now and has been engaging in some dubious practices for a long time. But I think the Khashoggi case was so high profile, dominated the headlines so much, and I think it was so clear that maybe the president and the cabinet were not telling the truth on this issue, that I think it was maybe the thing that spurred them to do it. And then one other thing I think that's kind of been the nail in the coffin for this is that CIA Director Gina Haspel has really stayed away from the Senate. So the people who, the senators who take part in these top secret briefings for foreign policy issues, they were supposed to hear from Gina Haspel over the last few weeks about whether or not the CIA believes Khashoggi was ordered to be killed by Saudi Arabia. And Gina Haspel was removed from those briefings, and she was asked not to appear. And so people feel, the senators at least feel like there's kind of somebody's not being honest with them. And I think that's kind of the big picture here for why they're challenging this.
And going forward, there's kind of two situations at play. You have the Senate's relations with President Trump kind of differing with him on this, but you also have the conflict in Yemen, which is ongoing. So what can we expect from both of those things?
Well, the Senate is going to be voting over the next week or so, and it's really going to be kind of a brawl in the Senate, because this is the first time that the Senate has really challenged the president's military authority in a really long time. And what's going to end up happening is people are going to kind of get into the weeds on what exactly the solution here is. So the things Congress can vote on, they're going to be able to vote on whether or not troops should be sent to Yemen or will be allowed to be sent to Yemen, whether or not certain arms deals can be approved or not. Another thing that's been talked about is sanctions on Saudi Arabia, or sanctions if the people responsible for the killing are not brought to justice or kind of published over the next 30 days was one of the numbers that was being thrown around. And then in Yemen, there's no easy prediction for Yemen. I mean, it's one of the bloodiest conflicts in the world right now, and one of the most chaotic ones, and then one of the most hard to solve ones. The UN tried to barter a peace deal, but that's fallen through. So there's really no end in sight there, at least.
So I want to talk about something that you spoke about earlier, that the Senate feels powerless. So given the fact that they are challenging the president's ability to wage war, something that hasn't been done by Congress in a very long time, what does this mean for the military powers resolution going forward?
That's a great question. I mean, this is one of the things that people don't always talk about, but Congress hasn't declared war since World War II. And I think any American can tell you, 4 or 5 different wars we've been in since World War II. At least we call them wars. And so the thing that we're talking about here, and this is one of the broader themes of our politics over the last couple of decades, is that the executive branch just has so much more power than the Senate does right now. So what the Senate's doing by challenging the Military Powers Act is an attempt to try to balance those scales a little bit. Now, whether or not that'll be successful, I think is anybody's guess, particularly with a divisive president like Donald Trump. I think it's one of those issues where this may not be the time that we really hash out the Military Powers Act as much as some of the more hardcore policy people may want it to be that way. But it certainly is unprecedented, because, I mean, nobody's even talked about the Military Powers Act since Iraq, really. It's really kind of disappeared. Especially during the Obama years, we kind of accepted that there's going to be drone strikes, there's going to be troop deployments, and nobody's really going to have a say on it. And the fact that attitude is maybe you're seeing a little change in that is actually really shocking to me. So who can say, but it's certainly an unprecedented challenge.
All right, well, something we're going to have to watch moving forward. Election day passed nearly a month ago, but several districts still have uncalled races due to absentee ballots.
Come on, it's It's not that hard.
My big man fingers are having a problem with these little tiny buttons.
Whoa, watch it there. Your blood pressure's gonna go through the roof.
Tell me about it. I'm trying to learn how to get it down. Instead, it keeps going up.
High blood pressure can increase the risk for heart attack or stroke. Learn how to keep yours at a healthy range.
Ever hear a voice command? Just say text barbershop to 97779.
That's not what I said.
Just give me that. Now my blood pressure's up.
Here we go. We're gonna go out there in the rain. We're gonna get wet. All right, here we go. Okay, quick. Oh yeah, yes. So much fun. Mwah. We're getting so wet. With the groove, show proof, keep it smooth as I bust the move. Where you step in swiftly, with me keep up. If not, just stop, pop a spot, put your feet up, read them, pay attention, listen to the melody. Remember what you heard, got my words to the spell of me. Top notch, got them all jumping like hopscotch, a jumping rope like double dutch in the air. Show me what you got, keep it hot like the heater. You thinking you a treat, cause you're sweet, but I'm sweeter. Leader of the pack, cause they all stay behind me. I'm old school, you don't skip tracks, you rewind me. Find me, working on my craft.
Controversy in North Carolina's 9th congressional district election began when election officials refused to certify the vote last week. Talking Points analyst Anthony Dabbundo is here to break down potential voter fraud and the election's integrity.
Mark Harris barely squeaked by on election night in North Carolina's 9th congressional district. He won the race by 905 votes, narrowly defeating Democrat Dan McCready. But when the time came to certify the votes, all 9 North Carolina officials refused to do so. They couldn't understand why the Bladen County absentee voting was so off. How did Mark Harris win 61% of the absentee votes in a county that's only 19% Republican? When they looked closer, they saw that Harris also won 95% of absentee mail-in votes in his primary upset. Then came the affidavits. 6 North Carolina voters made sworn statements saying that someone came to their home claiming to be an election official and illegally collected their ballots, unsealed. According to a Charlotte Observer report, one independent contractor who worked for the Harris campaign has a history of fraud. Leslie McCrae Dowless has been convicted for both fraud and perjury in the past. He's done get-out-the-vote work for 9 campaigns before, but he denied any involvement in this one. No one has given any explanation as to what may have caused this unusual vote spike. If you break down the swing from the 2016 election, every single county trended toward the Democrats by at least 4 points except one county, Bladen County. And 40% of requested absentees weren't even returned in Bladen County, which is an unusually high percentage. Going forward, it doesn't look like Harris will be seated when the new House takes over in January. If that doesn't happen, the Board of Elections has a few options. They could take Harris off the ballot and have a new election with a different Democrat, or they could throw out the November 6th results and have a special election between McCready and Harris again. Now, this has brought a lot of questions in. North Carolina GOP has received a lot of criticism for their voter ID laws, for potential gerrymandering. They had a court case to fight that. So how does it look for the GOP if they now have this controversy regarding potentially trying to steal an election? There's been a lot of controversy around this, and it's something that a lot of Democrats are up in arms about going forward.
Thank you, Anthony. The U.S. Supreme Court will hear a case with potentially colossal implications this week. Here to break down what it might mean for the president and Robert Mueller's investigation is Talking Points analyst Jack Watson.
Hey, thanks a lot, Elijah. Back in June, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear Gamble v. United States. That's a case you're going to hear a lot of this week. Now, what is it, and how does it relate to President Trump and the Mueller investigation? Now, this Thursday in the Supreme Court, arguments will be heard for the case in which a man who was originally convicted of a felony was prosecuted in state and federal court for a gun possession crime. Now, he's arguing that this violates the double jeopardy clause of the Fifth Amendment, and that's what the central question of this case really is. It concerns the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which states that under the double jeopardy clause, someone cannot be tried for the same crime twice, but because of a concept called the separate sovereigns exception, this might not always be the case. The idea is that since the federal government and the state government are two separate entities with separate laws and separate courts, they can try someone for the same crime since it was technically a crime against both institutions. Now, the way that the court rules could even affect the president's ability to pardon. Now, this is especially pertinent to the Mueller investigation and those convicted. Depending on the ruling, if the president pardons someone associated with the president's campaign on a federal level, that person could still be tried in, say, New York State court. A name that's being thrown around now for this purpose is Paul Manafort, who was recently in headlines because of Mueller's investigation accusing him of lying even after he agreed to a plea deal. Now, before the court is hearing the case, for some Washington context here, retiring Senator Orrin Hatch weighed in. He says in a September outside party memo to the Supreme Court that he is against the dual sovereign concept and says that the court rules if the court rules against the dual sovereign concept, that it would make it easier for the president to completely absolve any one of their crimes if he so chooses. Now, this could have heavy implications for the probe into Russian interference. Now, if the Supreme Court rules in favor of Gamble, that could greatly increase the president's power to pardon. But if they uphold the original ruling, the pardon would stay in its limited state. However, if the court rules, it will likely have mammoth implications for the executive branch moving forward. Gilat?
Thanks, Jack. And after the break, Elijah and I will focus on what happens next in Ukraine, including our own future travel plans. Don't go away.
I see you mobbing over her. Let's go. Let's mob. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, we mobbing. Come on, girl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl.
NATO ministers, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, are meeting in Brussels starting tomorrow to talk about Russia's recent attack on Ukrainian naval vessels. Both parties blame each other for the incident, with Kiev threatening war and Moscow calling the incident provoked.
Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko is calling for NATO warships to aid Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg called for Russia to allow unhindered navigation into the Azov Sea. And that's all the time we have for Talking Points this semester. And I'd just like to say a quick shout out to our executive producer, Jishnu Nair. He's done a fantastic job with this show for the last year, and we couldn't be happier. And thank you. Remember, you can see all of our episodes and webisodes and specials on CitrusTV.com/talkingpoints. For the last time this year, I'm Elijah Shama.
And I'm Gilat Melamed. Make sure to tune in next January when we're back. Have a great night, Syracuse.